for me, I Love Lucy was a safe space. It's comfort for me. When I want to feel safe and I'm watching or need something familiar or something to brighten the day, which I did a lot, which I needed a lot as a kid, I would turn to I Love Lucy. And it would be on after school and sometimes in the morning while I was getting ready for it, for school. But I just remember a couple of things. One huge thing, which is that Lucy was a rebel, right? She wasn't just going to be a quiet housewife who's going to follow orders from her husband. And she didn't marry another, boring white guy. She helped me understand that me being this brown person could be sexy, right? Like that's appealing. That is I could be appealing to someone. And I think I was also drawn to the friendship between Lucy and Ethel, which for me was community, right? It was these two people who were not blood, but created a family together along with their husbands. And were more like sisters, who would, you knew that those two people would do anything for each other. And we know what those kinds of friendships are like. But also there was a level of camp, right? There was a lot of innuendo and, there was the seeds of women's rights in there. There was conversations about women in the workplace, and it felt like it was trying to be progressive, in so many ways. But most of all, it's just really silly.
Undeniably.
And I didn't know this at the time, but also this, Lucille Ball was, a barrier breaker. She owned the studio. She owned her show. She owned her persona. She was a businesswoman. She was, strong. I really have a thing for strong women. I think it's because I came from one. So I tend to gravitate towards that. I was always really fascinated with those older shows. Like they used to show Our Miss Brooks on TV as well with Eve Arden, another strong female personality, which I was really drawn to, that Lucille Ball, I believe, produced her show. Anyway, but I was drawn to that. I was even drawn to what's the name of that? The Donna Reed show. I don't know what it was with these white families. I think they were probably some real utopian idea of what life is supposed to be like. Some ideal that I clearly wasn't living, but I could live maybe for a half hour, in a world that I would never be a part of. I don't know. It felt safer. It was like it felt happy, like a happy place. Reminds me of that movie. What was the movie with Tobey Maguire?
Pleasantville.
Oh, Pleasantville. Yeah, yes. I had a bit of a Pleasantville syndrome, I think, with these shows.
Of course. And I think you had previously cited Norman Lear too. And I think his work, especially as it's been revisited recently, is a testament to that. That it's just this.
I'm obsessed with Norman Lear. Like when I grow up, I want to be Norman Lear. Mm-hmm. I think anybody who's working in television should study what Norman Lear does, because he's still doing it, which is to use this medium as a way to have a cultural conversation about difficult concepts, uncomfortable issues, that television should be a place where we have those conversations. And part of that conversation is the power of storytelling, of allowing an audience to spend a few minutes in the shoes of someone else whose life is completely different from theirs, and to create empathy in that way. And so Norman Lear has this ability to not only do that, but crack you up at the same time, right? Like he understood comedy. He understands comedy. He understands how, how it can be best used and most effective. And but he also understood the responsibility he understands the responsibility that comes with creating television. And so, for me, he is an icon and a hero.
Billy Porter talks about the Tennessee Williams effect and how that
Yeah.
relates to like the Golden Girls and that sort of thing. But of course, all of Tennessee Williams' work and where
For
we're
sure.
finding ourselves.
Well, it's an easier way for us to have people listen to us, right? If we live in the mouths of women and characters and female characters as writers, as LGBT writers or queer male writers, we can do and say things that we would never be allowed, or at least then, we're never allowed to do or say, or get people to watch, right? Nobody was going to watch, we were told, for gay men, living together in Miami. But people would watch for older women who are widows come together and support each other. And we could have a conversation about created families, about chosen families, about creating community, about archetypes within our own communities that actually exist in others, right? So we could draw parallels. And then they were really sneaky and subversive and actually put gay storylines within those shows. So, we were going to have our cake and we were going to eat it too.
I'd love to hear from you, one, like what your first memories of being drawn to musical theater were. If you happen to feel like you kind of understand why that may be, being and tying that to your LGBTQ, that's great. But if not, just hearing about those. But also to hear what you've heard from not just LGBTQ people, but people in general about the power of musical theater, having had it being such a huge part of your career.
Right. Well, yeah. For me, I was a kid who was involved in the arts very early on. So I was aware of musical theater. It was something that I aspired to do, but that also was part of my life. Like, I was born in 1973. So my mother got to experience the rage that was West Side Story. And the historic moments that came with that, along with Rita Moreno winning her Oscar. And so as a Puerto Rican boy, all I heard about was how proud people were of Rita, who was Puerto Rican, and how much pride they had in the fact that this movie, which was very much about the lives that my mother lived, that this movie was so successful. So I grew up worshiping Rita Moreno, a musical theater god. So that led me to more musical theater, which led me to a chorus line, right? And in a chorus line, there is ample opportunity to talk about LGBTQ issues, and they do, which at the time was, this was the 70s, was completely subversive, but the theater could do that. And I also knew that I started to realize that theater was a place where I could go to find characters that could in some ways reflect my existence that wasn't happening on television or film. So and then you add the fact that when these people could no longer talk about how they felt, that they would then start singing about it, my gay head exploded. And then you were given permission to dance? What? Like I could sing and dance and this is a job? Okay, where do I sign up for that? So, there's even a character in a chorus line who is a gay Puerto Rican dancer. Tragic. We always have to be, we're always so tragic. My career alone is proof of that. But again, that was that was one of the first times I ever saw myself in pop culture. It wasn't on television, it wasn't in film, it was in a Broadway show. So, you know, then the chorus line led me to Sondheim, and Sondheim freed me. You know, then I understood so much of about love and about life in general. And you know, Stephen Sondheim is a prophet. He is. There are very few artists who understand the human experience better than Stephen Sondheim, and the fact that the fact that he was using music and musical theater in order to have that conversation with us is, I mean, how lucky are we? He could have just been a psychologist or a therapist, but instead, you know, he created art that was transformative for many of us. I remember the first time I heard Into the Woods and understood things about my relationship with my father that I didn't understand until I heard certain songs, you know? So anyway, you know, musical theater, it runs in it's part of my life's blood. And the fact that I got to be a part of something as iconic and culture changing as Rent is still something I marvel at. I still pinch myself, you know? And that, I have to tell you, only happened because of the audacity of youth. The fact that I woke up one morning and was like, I'm gonna do that show. Anyway, but I also, in doing that show, understand on a whole new level the power of musical theater. To see young people during the late 90s, early 2000s come to this show to really reckon with their feelings about HIV and AIDS and the people that they'd lost and the lives that they had to lead because of the world we were living in at the time, which is something funny to say right now, given the parallels. But, you know, that show was a celebration and also a remembrance of people we lost for a decade. So I hear from people all the time about how that show was a catharsis. That's the power of musical theater. Well, yeah. You know, and my favorite musicals aren't necessarily the big glitzy ones, shiny ones either. You know, they're usually dealing with pretty dark material. Like you know, aside from Rent, I was all about Cabaret. I was, you know, Chorus Line is not exactly a walk in the park. You know, we're talking about childhood traumas a lot there. You know, Cabaret is about the Holocaust and about the beginning of the Second World War and the changing of cultures. And, you know.
Mm-hmm. Well, sci-fi, I know you're a fan of. And that's another topic we're covering. So basically we'll have episodes discussing different topics, and we're kind of talking about sci-fi and fantasy, and you know, you now have such an important place in the history of sci-fi and LGBTQ storytelling. But we'd love to hear a little bit about kind of what drew you to that genre in your youth, and what maybe links you draw there. And then again, I mean, I feel like it's the same story as Rent. Like, and then what you've heard from other people now that you've been a part of the history.
Yeah, well, you know, for me, again, I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself a little bit here in the sense that sci-fi for me was an idealized world. If we're talking about Star Trek, which is what I was watching, right? Star Trek offered a view and a peek at a future in which someone like me could succeed and could be an equal member of society with no fear. And for me, you know, watching Star Trek was a way of, it was a prayer in a lot of ways. It was a way of me having a conversation with myself about how to get our world closer to that one. So it was a cerebral exercise in many ways, right? But you know, it was comforting to know that given how popular Star Trek is and has been a part of our culture, that we all agreed that that was where we all wanted to go, right? That we at least agreed that that was the ideal. How we would get there, if we would get there, would be up to us. So that's why Star Trek meant so much to me as a kid. The fact that Anthony Rapp and I get to present this idealized future to a new generation is still unreal to me. And so when I go to work, I'm not kidding. I think about every time I go to work and I put on that uniform and I work on a scene, I really do have the young people in mind who are watching this and dreaming with me about the world that I get to inhabit at work. A world where no matter your race, sexual orientation, or gender, you have as much opportunity to succeed and live up to your human potential as anybody else. If young people can grow up with that seed of hope, then I'm doing my job. Literally play a part of a family unit on Star Trek Discovery that reflects the reality of thousands of families across this country. And they have just as much right and need to see themselves reflected in the future. And as a man of color, it means even more to me. So, and I get to hear about how it affects people in their daily lives when people reach out to me to talk about the hope that it's given them. And there's nothing better than that. Take it from me. I have had, not to brag, but I've had 30 years almost of the fruit of my labor being that people reach out to me daily saying that I comforted them, or this role meant something to them, that they saw themselves finally. For me, maybe not every actor, but for this actor, the biggest reward is when someone says, "You helped me be seen." That's it for me. You can keep the Oscar, you can keep the Emmy, you can keep it all. To me, that's everything.
Was there, maybe in Star Trek or another property, was there a specific character that made you feel seen growing up?
In Star Trek?
Or sci-fi or fantasy in general?
Oh yeah, I mean, I was a pretty, cerebral kid. So I was always really fascinated with Spock in the original series. But as I got older, because my Star Trek was really next gen, I loved how loving and professional and empathetic and beautiful Dr. Crusher was. And so I think about her a lot when I go to work as well. Infinite diversity and infinite combinations. Mm-hmm. If we keep our eye on that, we will do him a great honor.